Hey guys, this is a revolver I've had for a while. This is a 1917 Smith & Wesson M1917. It's a 45 ACP revolver, and they started making these back in 1917, I guess. Colt made them, Smith & Wesson made them for World War I. But this particular one was actually made after 1937, in fact probably 1938 or later. This is a Brazilian contract model. And in 1937, the Brazilian government decided they wanted to use a 45 ACP cartridge and update their handguns. So they went with the 1917 revolver, which they actually call it the M1937, I think. And this one, they made two batches of them. There were two contracts. The first contract was for 25,000 revolvers in 1937. And then they had another contract in 1946, and that was for another additional 12,000 revolvers. And apparently they used these up into the 70s, and then at some point in the late 80s, early 90s, they started importing them into the U.S. In fact, this has a import mark on it. It came from Brazil. And there are a couple of minor feature differences between the original early 1917 and the Brazilian contract. The most notable is the fact that it has a Brazilian crest on the right side of the gun, on the side plate, which on this particular one's a little hard to see because it's, you know, so this gun's pretty well worn. The finish is pretty bad on it, but still shoots though, shoots like crazy. Another feature of the gun, the Brazilian contract, was some of them came with checkered grips, some of them came with smooth grips, but out of the original 1917s, I think they all had smooth grips. In fact, Smith & Wesson even makes this model today, I think, a reproduction of it that has smooth grips on it. Another thing that differentiates it between this and the original 1917s is the rear sight. And the Brazilians wanted the rear sight to be cut square, and the originals had a more of a rounded, kind of a half-moon rear sight. So I can get this on camera, but that's it's a square on this one anyways. And they take the moon clips, obviously. Although the original 1917, I'm not sure about the Brazilian contract, if they sent them half-moon clips or if they had full-moon clips. But full moon is what you normally find today when people shoot them. It's just a lot easier to load and unload the gun. But originally the 1917 came with a half moon clip. In fact, I've even seen some that had a 2-round clip. Presumably the half moon would be easier to stow the clips, because this does take up a little bit of room, you know. Cylinder here, you can see this is a standard, this is an in-frame Smith & Wesson revolver. I think they made this off the 44 hand ejector. And then of course Colt made the 1917s. They didn't make the 37 Brazilian contract, but you can usually tell the early Colt 1917 by the fact that it doesn't have this little underlug. And of course the cylinder catch on the Colt, I think it pulls backward instead of forward or something, and it looks different, but that's usually the easiest way to identify them, just visually. And if you look down inside the cylinder, you'll see the little ridge down in there. And this actually headspaces off of the case. Now, you can use the moon clips. They also make 45 auto rim. After so many of these wound up in the civilian market, especially the 1917s, they started making auto rim, which was basically a 45 ACP with a rim on it so that it would extract. The problem with and you can put standard 45 ACP cartridges in it and they will fire. They won't go too far in, they headspace off the cylinder inside. But when you pull them out, you got to use your fingernail or come from the front with a pencil or something. They will not extract like that. Here on the moon clip, this one extracts just fine, pushes it right out. It's a neat little gun. It's fun to shoot. 45 ACP, it's a pretty good defensive cartridge. And the clips themselves, loading them, It isn't too bad. It depends on the clip. Some of these metal ones can get a little stiff and they're a little hard to get the cartridge pushed into. But what's generally more difficult is removing them. And Brownells actually sells a tool that you can buy for however much plus shipping to actually get this thing off of here. But I saw the tool and I thought, well, I'll just make me one, and that's what I did. I took it was just a standard nut driver and a 1/2-inch socket, 1/2-inch inside diameter, and I ground it down to where there's just a little shoulder right there. You can see it on the thing. And what it does, basically, you run it up around the cartridge, and then that little shoulder catches and pulls it off. So it looks a little awkward, but it's a whole lot easier than trying to pull them off by hand. So you can get them off of there in no time, really. And there's the clip. Pretty simple, not too complicated. In fact, I guess now some of the modern manufacturers, they make these out of plastic. So it'd probably be a lot easier to load and unload. But that's about it. It's a good little gun, good shooter. I wouldn't shoot any really high pressure rounds out of it probably. It's an old gun. So anyways, that's about it. I'll leave you with some shooting video that I took the other day. Okay, and you can actually load this thing with just standard cartridges, 45 ACP cartridges without the clips. And they'll go in there. There's a little rim right down inside of there where they actually sit. The headspace is off the case. So, there we go. And you can see them in there, and obviously the extractor doesn't work, but just a little, pull on them a little with my fingernail, and they come right out. Well, mostly come right out. Unless you're firing really high pressure rounds out of this thing, you're probably going to slide out, and I don't think I'd fire any high pressure rounds out of this gun.